Good to see all of you again. I hope everyone is doing well and now in the swing of the semester. This is lecture number 3. We're going to be dealing with chapter 19, which looks at the flip side of the coin that we examined in lecture number 2 and chapter 18. We looked there at the macro picture of the Second Industrial Revolution. We examined the role of the robber barons, who created new organizational paradigms, monopolies known as trust, to control the vast empires like railroads and oil and steel that they created, which fueled so much of the technological progress of America in the 19th century, created millions of jobs, made the U.S. a wealthy nation, but also divided the country more than it had ever been divided before, between rich and poor, between the owner and the worker. And in fact, the rise of industrialization brought about a shift in the style of working for many Americans. In the second half of the 19th century, things got both better and worse for industrial laborers who made the new American businesses run. During this period, real wages rose. That meant what you could buy with the money you made. That rose. But at the same time, working conditions improved, although they improved very slowly. Labor begins to organize and push for more improvements and better conditions and these sorts of things. Life in general, you could argue, improved for most Americans as the two technologies became more prevalent. As there was more wealth, you begin to get the evolution of a real middle class. But all of this took place very slowly. It was not necessarily evident at the time, and of course this constituted rapid change, and rapid change is always very discombobulating, it's very painful, and it's very confusing. During this period, you're going to see most industrial workers putting in 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. So 60 hours a week was the average work week. So if you were a skilled worker, you were an electrician, you were a plumber, you were a printer or something like that, you made about 20 cents an hour. If you were an unskilled worker, and most people in the new industrial economy were unskilled workers, you made about half that. You made about 10 cents an hour. Of course, those figures are so far below what we have today, it's really kind of hard to get a handle on what that meant. So let's put it in a context that makes it a little bit more identifiable with us. Most industrial laborers made somewhere between $400 to $500 a year at a time when it took about $600 a year to live a decent middle-class existence. So you had people almost within reach of that, and you had some people who were very far from achieving that. There were good jobs that paid well, in which working conditions were fairly tolerable. Work in the construction industry, if you were a machinist, if you worked for the government, you did office or clerical work, if you were in the printing industry, if you worked out west in one of the gold or silver mines, pay was pretty good and conditions fairly decent. But there were far more what you would call bad jobs. Jobs in the eastern coal mines were dangerous and hard, for example. Work in agriculture was long and difficult. If you worked in the garment industry, what today we would call sweatshops, you worked as an unskilled factory employee, assembling machines, moving parts, these sorts of things, then pay was low and conditions were harsh. There were very few holidays. You had Christmas, you had Easter, but of course businesses did not run on Sunday. You had July 4th, and you had Washington's birthday, and that was sort of it. There were no Memorial Days, there were no Labor Days, there were no occasions that we have spread across the calendar in our time to close the banks and not deliver the mail and have mattress sales and that sort of thing. The things that broke up life were few and far between. So work was relentless, and it was monotonous, it was grueling, and it was dangerous. Not only was there very often no sense of personal satisfaction to be gained in a lot of these factory jobs, there was a great deal of danger to be experienced in these factory jobs. There were very few safety standards. What safety standards there were very low. There was nothing like the Occupational Health and Safety Administration that we have today to make sure that there were fire extinguishers around and fire exits and first aid kits and this sort of stuff. There was nothing done to shield workers from being hurt by the machinery that they were working on, and so it was very easy to get injured on the job. For example, the railroads, which is in the sort of the key industry of the Second Industrial Revolution, every year, 1 out of every 26 workers got injured on the railroad. 1 out of every 26 workers got injured on the railroad, and 1 out of every 399 were killed on the job while working for a railroad. We fight wars today when we don't have that kind of an attrition rate. And even if we ignore the loss of life or the loss of eyesight or limbs or other injuries like that, factory workers endured what today would be considered intolerable conditions. They worked in dust and with chemicals and with pollutants. And all of this, remember, was very, very new. This was a brand new economy. These were brand new scientific processes. These were brand new machines. Nobody really understood some of the implications that went along with all of this. The fact that things might look gross or smell nasty or something like that hardly meant that they were dangerous. Rural Americans worked around things that looked unpleasant and smelled unpleasant that you wouldn't want to put in your mouth or you wouldn't want to step in all the time. That did not necessarily make them deadly. But now you're dealing with things that could become deadly, or exposure to them over a long period of time could become deadly. But nobody knew. And so we now confront for the first time something that's going to be kind of a consistent issue during the Second Industrial Revolution, and that is the lag time that exists between creating a problem, recognizing there is a problem, and then being able to address the problem. There's just a certain amount of time that has to uncoil. For example, if you're being exposed to a chemical or a pollutant that's going to cause you cancer in 20 years, well, it's going to take those 20 years to roll by and people start to come down with cancers before anyone's going to notice. And even longer than for medical professionals and scientists to say, hey, look, we suddenly have a whole bunch of people coming down with this cancer. Do they have anything in common? And trace it back. Oh, they all did this kind of work. They were exposed to this kind of chemical. I'll give you a very real example. Toward the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th, it became possible to make the faces of wristwatches and pocket watches luminous. That is, that you could read them in the dark because the hands of the watch and the numbers on the watch would glow. Well, the way that they made those glow is to paint them with iridium, which is radioactive, and it glows. And of course, this was very fine work, and it was done usually by women, and they would have very fine-tipped paintbrushes, and they would sit there all day long, and they would paint this radioactive material onto the hands, the dials, the numbers of watches. And when the tip of the brush began to get a little bit frayed, they would lick it with their tongue to straighten it out again. And of course, what they were doing then is that they were painting their tongue with the radioactive material. And they would do this hundreds of times every day, day after day, week after week, month after month. And eventually, of course, this began to cause cancers. But it took many years for that to happen, and even longer for doctors to put it all together. And so this is a real world example of how people were being exposed to things that seem seemed very unpleasant at the time, but not particularly dangerous, that were in fact dangerous. People just did not know. And so working in these factories was hard, it was hot, it was dirty, it was grueling, it was repetitive, and it was very often dangerous. And it wasn't just men who were exposed to all this. Women and children made up a fair percentage of the labor force. In 1870, 15% of all women over the age of 16 worked in the industrial economy. Now, of course, that's a little bit of a misnomer because in reality, almost all women were part of the economy. On the farm, everybody worked, men, women, children, and it is only sort of the vantage point of today that would have us look back at the work done by women in the 19th century and argue that that was not work. The cooking and cleaning and sewing and tending gardens and drawing water and these sorts of things was not work. It, of course, was work. It was very hard work, and it was necessary work. Children were given chores on the farm or around the house, and those chores were not the kind that we had growing up. Mow the lawn, take out the trash, walk the dog, chores that relieved the burden on our parents a little bit and taught us responsibility and a work ethic. These were chores that were necessary to the family survival. If the chickens didn't get fed, if the wood didn't get chopped, if the water didn't get drawn from the well, if the beans weren't picked, then the farm was going to fail. The family was literally going to starve, and everybody was put to work as soon as they could, and that work was very hard, and it was, of course, constant. It had to be done every single day. You can't take a week's vacation from milking the cows or bringing water into the house or having firewood in the fireplace. And so it made sense that women and children would also be part of the industrial economy as well. And as the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution played itself out, more and more people moved from the farm into the cities. They left the farms, which needed fewer and fewer people because mechanization was making them more and more efficient. The city and the town, of course, were very alluring because of all the new technologies could be accessed there, things like electricity, for example, and so there were jobs, and people left the farms and they moved to the cities. And when they moved to the cities, they suddenly had to buy groceries instead of grow their own food. They had to buy fuel instead of go out and chop their own wood. They had expenses, and those expenses could only be paid for by earning a wage. And with wages so low, it made sense that women and children would go into the labor force. After all, they'd worked on the farm, so they will work in the city, but that was a very different kind of work. It wasn't the work done under the eye of your parents out on the farm in a natural setting, hard and tedious as that might be. It was work done now under the watchful eye of a foreman or a boss of some kind, and in a factory or a mill or a railroad yard or a sweatshop or something like that. So qualitatively, it was very, very different. The hours were very, very different, and the dangers were much greater. So you had more and more women working all the time in industrial capacity. So in 1870, 15% of women over the age of 16 were employed in the industrial economy. By 1900, it was 20% of all women over the age of 16. That represented 5.3 million women. And you could find women in almost every style of employment. The 303 occupations listed in the census of 1900, there were women employed in 296 of them. And of course, they were not employed in great numbers. In some of them, doctors, lawyers, these kinds of things, they would be relatively rare. But in a lot of industries, women would become dominant, and this would begin a process known as feminization. So feminization means that as women move in larger numbers into a certain field, the men exit it. The men left it, or they moved up into its management positions. So jobs today that people would say are stereotypically staffed mostly by women. secretaries, nurses, librarians, teachers, these kinds of things, sort of stereotype, what kind of jobs do you find more women in than you find men? At the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, there were very few women in these jobs. Men were nurses, men were secretaries, men were the teachers, men were the librarians. But the Second Industrial Revolution opens these fields to women, and as they move into them, the men move out. It becomes to be seen as women's work, and men go off into other fields. And one of the reasons this becomes women's work is because women were paid a great deal less for doing this kind of work than men, which made them much more attractive to employers. And why were women paid less? It was because most women ceased working when they got married. And so the idea was that, young women worked for a brief period of time. They enjoyed a little taste of independence while they were looking for a husband, and then they got married. And once they were married, then their household duties, the cooking, the cleaning, the caring for children, would consume so much of their time that, of course, they couldn't work anymore. And since the women weren't going to hang around to be long-term employees, employers could argue, well, then we should pay them less. Women are single by and large, and so they're not needing to raise money to feed a family like the men that we employ are, and therefore we can pay them less. And then you get down to the bottom line logic. Why would I hire a woman over a man? And the only reason I would hire a woman over a man is because I can pay her less. These were the kind of dominant attitudes. In 1900, only 5% of married women worked because once they got married, financially, they usually did not have to work. When financial necessity, however, intervened, then more married women did work. For example, black women whose husbands made far less money, who operated in a disadvantaged economic status, you found 25% of all married black women working in 1900. So where it was necessary, it was done, but by and large, a woman only made about half as much of a man for doing the same kind of work. And children made even less. Between 1870 and 1900, the number of children working in industrial labor rose by 130%. So you had 1.8 million children under the age of 15 employed in factories and exposed to the same sort of dust and pollutants and chemicals and hardships and dangers as adults. And why would you hire children? Again, it's because you could get them cheaper than you could get either an adult woman or an adult male. There was also prisoner labor. Some employers went and hired convicts from the prisons and paid them virtually nothing or paid the state virtually nothing for them. And so this was a boon for employers. Cheap labor was good. With millions of immigrants coming into the country every year, there were plenty of people desperate for work. So basic law of supply and demand, the more of something you have, the less its value, and the more workers were out there, then you had a lot of competition for jobs, and that put the employer in the catbird seat, and he could pay a very low wage and still staff his factory, still staff his mill, still keep the railroads running. And so this was part of the reality. But the flip side of that, of course, is that people were getting jobs and people were getting paychecks. And even if they were exposed to these kinds of conditions, that was vital to have employment. And so, people took these jobs. They had to take these jobs, and at least the opportunity was there. The other thing that, of course, occurs here is something called feminization. As I said, as more and more women moved into a field, the men moved out, or they went into its supervisory positions. So the nurses might increasingly be women, but the doctors are men. You're going to have more women who are teachers, but the principals of the school are going to be men. And this process of feminization, from the vantage point of the 21st century, seems very unfair and stereotypical. But at the time, and remember, it's always important to view history from its own context, to stand in the shoes of the people who lived at that moment and view their world through their eyes. At the time, this was a giant leap forward for women. It meant that women could have lifelong careers as nurses or teachers or librarians or secretaries that had never been opened to them before. And so this is sort of a leap forward, if you will. But nonetheless, this was part of the harsh reality of the new industrial economy. For most men and women who worked in that economy, they were engaged in unskilled labor. They bolted part A to part B all day long. They drilled a hole into part C all day long. They moved boxes all day long. They tended power looms all day long by replacing spindles of cotton and these sorts of things. And so there was lots of unskilled labor. It didn't pay very well. It was dangerous and it was boring. And in most instances, it was completely unrewarding. And so there was a lot of changing of jobs. I mean, if one skilled job is the same as the other skilled job, then, at least changing from working in this factory to this factory provided a brief sense of doing something different, being someplace different. So there was lots of job changing, and with lots of job changing, there was lots of moving. It was discovered in the census of 1900 that only half of all Americans lived in the same place that they had lived 10 years before. And this was consistent over a number of census, that 50% of the country had moved, physically moved, during the last 10 years. And not only was there a lot of physical mobility, there was a substantial amount of economic and social mobility. 1/4 of all unskilled manual laborers managed to rise into the middle class over the second half of the 19th century. And this included immigrants. It included groups of Americans who were generally viewed with suspicion, like Jews, for example. Half of all the Jews in Boston made it into the middle class. The Irish, the Italian immigrants, not very far behind. So this is unprecedented in human history, to see that large percentage of a population move from the lower to the middle class in such a brief period of time. Of course, understand that whenever somebody gives you statistics, do the reverse mathematics. So if we say that 25% of all unskilled workers managed to rise in the middle class, we're also saying that 75% didn't, and that seems like a much more damning statistic, except for this. The fact that 25% of the unskilled laboring class did make it to the middle class was hugely important because it injected hope and ambition into the system. You might not make it, but you probably knew somebody who did, and therefore you could hope that you might still obtain that goal, or that your children might be able to do better. And you cannot underestimate the power of hope in an economic system, because it is only when there is utter hopelessness that you tend to get turbulence and rebellion and this sort of stuff. And the fact that there was so little of this, relatively speaking, in America during the second half of the 19th century is predicated on the technological advancements that made life better and the economic and social and physical mobility that allowed people to feel like they had a chance to get ahead, even if they weren't able to attain it at that particular moment. That said, the changes were occurring very slowly. It was hard to discern them as they played themselves out, and not everybody was willing to take the glass half full approach. And a lot of people living in the moment looked around and were very dissatisfied with the way things were, and this was especially true of people in the industrial laboring classes. And this is going to lead to another important phenomenon of the second industrial revolution, the second half of the 19th century, and that is the rise of the labor union. The labor union, this is sort of a new thing in American history. You'd had guilds and associations before, but they weren't quite the same thing as labor unions. And the labor union is born out of the fact that the nature of work itself has changed. So before industrialization, most people worked for themselves. Or they worked immediately for their employer. A boss might only have 2 or 3 employees, or maybe 5 or 10, and there was therefore a very personal relationship. They tended to share the work, and they certainly shared the working conditions and these sorts of things. And of course, it is universal in human experience that employees do not like bosses, and bosses are sometimes put out by employees. But it was very human. The contact was there. It was immediate. If the farmer hires laborers to supplement his family to bring in the crop, they're all out in the hot sun harvesting the crop together. They're doing the same kind of work. But once you begin to have industrial labor, then the owner of the factory is no longer there on the factory floor working alongside his employees, and his employees become more and more numerous as the work becomes grander in scale and more complex in conduct, and that means that you get the rise of foremen and managers and middle management, and so layers begin to build up between the employee and the owner of the factory, the owner of the industry, and that removes the human element of it. Now you have accountants and managers who are being paid by the success in increasing profitability or efficiency or something like that, and therefore they have incentive to push their workers harder, to disregard their concerns or anything that would get in the way of profitability or efficiency or productivity or something like that. And this means that it is more and more difficult, to the point of being impossible, for the employee to address their difficulties and their problems with management, let alone ownership. Out on the farm, if you thought that the farmer was making you work too long before you got a break, or you had lunch, you could look him in the eye and you could tell him that, or you could say, well, he's not taking lunch either, so we're in the same boat together. You could have that relationship, and now in the factories, that relationship is an impossibility. And the other thing, of course, that is going on here is a sort of fundamental shift in the way labor is going to start thinking about how it is being treated. So, the idea that out in rural America, before the Second Industrial Revolution, if you were helping bring in the harvest and you thought your employer, the farmer, was treating you unfairly, the last thing in the world that you were going to do was probably go up and say, you know what, I'm not going to do any more work until you let me have, a 15-minute break every couple of hours. I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to sit here in your farm. I'm going to sit on your equipment, and I'm not going to work again until you meet my demands. That would have been unthinkable in pre-industrial America. That would have been unthinkable. You hired on. You understood what the work was. Your employer is out there doing the same kind of work, probably right next to you. He's enduring the same sort of conditions, working the same sort of hours. If you think there's a problem, you can address it directly with him, or you can quit and leave, but you certainly don't take control of the farm and say, I'm not going to work again until you grant me certain concessions, until you give in to my demands. This would have been unthinkable in small town, rural, agricultural, pre-industrial America. But in the new industrial economy, how was the employer ever going to hear from the employee? How was ownership ever going to know what the grievances of the workers were, and if ownership and management were, as they almost always tended to be, willing to ignore the demands of labor because labor was cheap? You could get rid of the people who were making demands and bring in people eager to have their jobs for as much or less money. Then how does labor get leverage? And the answer was the labor union, the labor union. Now, this was a paradigm shift, as I said, and because it was a paradigm shift, this idea that workers could try and make demands on employers or owners, that was something that was unthinkable before the Second Industrial Revolution, and it was going to take a lot to get people to shift toward this new way of looking at the labor management, labor ownership relationship. And as a consequence of this, 19th century labor unions, by and large, were not popular. Part of that was, the basic, nature of what they were trying to do. Part of it, a large part of it, was the tactics that they're going to wind up employing, but they weren't popular. Never more than 2% of the total labor force would join a union in the 19th century. Now, of course, the total labor force means, everything. It means professors, and it means farm workers and small business owners and that kind of thing. So that's a little bit of a deceptive statistic. So let's just narrow it down. Let's say how many industrial workers, the people who were caught up in this new style of labor, this new economy, how many of them joined a labor union in the 19th century? And the answer is 10%. 10%. So 10% is a lot more than 2, but it also means that 90% of industrial workers did not join a labor union. They did not want anything to do with a labor union. Labor unions, like the great industries that will be given birth by the Second Industrial Revolution, follow an evolutionary arc. So we saw the great industries go from invention and innovation to widespread entrance into the field and cutthroat competition that nearly ruins the industry, which is saved by organization and monopoly. There's an arc. Well, the same thing with labor unions. Your first labor unions were incredibly idealistic. They sought goals that were larger than improved working conditions and better wages and this sort of stuff. And then you had a middle stage where labor organization still has a foot in that idealistic world, but now they're looking toward more pragmatic reforms. And then finally you have a stage where all the idealism is basically gone, and we're just hardcore negotiating for better wages and better working conditions. And this arc is, we can follow this arc through the story of 3 of the most popular labor unions at the various stages of labor evolution during this period. And one of the earliest unions that could actually be identified as such was the National Labor Union. The National Labor Union, which comes into existence in 1866, or so right after the American Civil War. It's the brainchild of a guy named William H. Sylvis, S-Y-L-V-I-S, William Sylvis. And he was very charismatic person who was able to get a lot of people excited and wanting to follow him. He was the first one who was sort of arguing successfully that labor needs to organize. The National Labor Union represented only skilled workers, so not unskilled workers, skilled workers, people who had more money, who had skills and talents that therefore were harder to find, not as easy to replace. And what Sylvis did is he got a lot of little unions that represented these skilled workers, printers and machinists and this. He got them to come together in a national labor union. But what did the National Labor Union advocate? What it advocated was idealistic. It wanted to create workers' cooperatives. It wanted workers to own the means of production. It wanted the workers to manage the factories in which they labored. He wanted to create sort of a workers' utopia, the perfect society based on the harmony of the workers owning the means of production and managing themselves and these sorts of things, and all of the societal benefits that would flow from such a benign system. And it was a very attractive idea to a lot of people. It harkened back to the utopian impulse in America that had existed from the moment that the Pilgrims and the Puritans had arrived on the coast of New England, that we're going to build a perfect society centered around, at first, the perfect church, but then now around the perfect economic paradigm. And the problem is utopia is a lovely thing to think about, and it can be a very alluring and seductive vision, but it doesn't work. Utopias don't work because human beings are not designed to be utopian. And nonetheless, the National Labor Union managed by 1868 to have recruited 640,000 members. But Silvis died in 69, and with his death, the union fell apart because it was really his dream, his vision, his charisma that had attracted people to it. And so, this is one of the things about a utopia. You have a visionary, you have a leader, everybody gets excited, he's the guy, we're going to follow him, but when that spark dies out, then the vision typically dies out with it. In the same year that Silvis and the National Labor Union meet their end, 1869, a guy named Uriah S. Stevens started another labor union that's going to have a lot more success and be our middle stage in the development of labor unions. And his organization was called the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. The Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. Knights with a K, like, knight in shining armor. And remember, in the second half of the 19th century, Americans were really enamored. It was quite the cultural fad to have all sorts of organizations for all sorts of purposes, who had really regal and cool sounding names and had special ceremonies, and you just couldn't be the chairman of something, you had to be the grand poobah, and you wore sashes and swords and hats, and you had secret handshakes and this sort of stuff. This is just part of the second half of the 19th century, something people liked. And so to call a labor union the Holy Order of the Knights of Labor infuses it with a spirit that is not very pragmatic in a way. And Knights of Labor came, of course, to be the actual name by which this organization was referred to. But it grew very slowly, perhaps it because of that initial impulse to make it more of a society than a labor union. But in 1879, a guy named Terence Powderly took over. And he was a much more pragmatic kind of a guy. The Knights of Labor, in contrast to the National Labor Union, let anybody in. Skilled worker, unskilled worker, you could come in. And its ideas were Jacksonian. And by Jacksonian, we mean that it saw itself as representing the common guy, the little guy versus the powerful, versus the elite. It opposed monopoly. It opposed special privilege. It opposed the connected and the powerful getting treated differently than the common man. And it had pragmatic demands. What did the Knights of Labor want? They wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted to abolish child and prisoner labor, not just because they thought those things were wrong, but of course paying children and paying prisoners was to get labor for next to nothing, and that undercut wages for adult men and adult women. So those are very pragmatic ends. They wanted an end to monopolies and to trust. So they didn't like the rise of the robber barons and the power that the robber barons got from that. But the Knights of Labor also advocated certain utopian reforms. They wanted worker-run industries where every man was his own employers. They argued for temperance. This is an American reform impulse that goes back at least to the 1820s, and temperance said, let's get rid of the booze, let's get rid of the alcohol. It's this great evil in society. It leads to alcoholism. It leads to spousal and child abuse. It leads to people losing their jobs and becoming vagrants and these sorts of things. And laudable or not, what does this have to do with conditions in factories? And the answer is, well, it doesn't much. So the Knights of Labor kind of have their foot in this old utopian impulse and a foot in pragmatic reform in the here and now. It grew relatively slowly. In 1882, it only has 42,000 members. So Silva's in a year managed to get 640,000 members, and here you are, 69 to 82, so you're, a decade or more in, and you've only got 42,000 members. Now, things picked up in 1885, 110,000 members, but the thing about the Knights of Labor is that they disliked strikes. They disliked direct action. They were going to try and use what the radical abolitionists in the pre-Civil War era would call moral suasion. We're going to make the intellectual argument. We're going to help you see that you ought to treat your workers better. And that meant that for people willing to enter a labor union, it's not very attractive. If you are willing to join a labor union in the second half of the 19th century, you are by definition somebody who is inclined to radical action. And a labor union that's not going to press employers, is simply going to try and jawbone them in to making changes, is probably not going to be very appealing to you. And this had a lot to do with why the Knights of Labor were recruited so slowly and their numbers were so low, even after they'd been around for almost 2 decades. But then in 1885, something happened that would at least briefly give the Knights of Labor a new spark. And what happened in 1885 was a local chapter staged a wildcat strike. That means a strike that's not authorized by the larger organization. They staged a successful strike against the Missouri and Pacific Railroad. The Missouri and Pacific Railroad, the same Missouri and Pacific Railroad that gives its name to Mopac in Austin, who's has the Missouri and Pacific Railroad tracks running down the center of it for a good distance. And this strike caught the railroad by surprise, and the railroad reacted by granting some of the local chapter's demands, and therefore what the Knights of Labor have accidentally managed to do is stage the first successful strike against a major industry in American history. And that grabbed a lot of attention. That made a lot of newspaper headlines. And as a consequence of that, workers flocked to the Knights of Labor. In 1885, before the strike, it had 110,000 members. In 1886, in the aftermath of the strike, it had 730,000 members. So in a single year, 620,000 people joined the Knights of Labor. They said, hey, here's an organization that's willing to take action, that's willing to stand up to big business, that's willing to push back, that's willing to strike, and it has proven successful. This is the future. This is the way forward. But unfortunately, it was a one-off. In 1886, the Knights of Labor, now converted to the pro-strike position, staged a strike against the Texas and Pacific Railroad. But this one didn't catch the railway companies by surprise. They were prepared and ready for it, and they fired the striking workers. They hired people to come in and take their place, and the strike failed. And when the strike failed, all of those people who had joined the Knights of Labor thinking, hey, they found the recipe, exited the Knights of Labor just as quickly. And by 1890, it was down to only 100,000 members. So it lost that addition of 620,000 people as fast as it gained it. And a few years after 1890, the Knights of Labor died out completely. There was, however, an organization that showed up to take its place. It was born in 1881. The American Federation of Labor. And if that sounds familiar to you, it's because the American Federation of Labor, better known as the AFL, which has merged in the 20th century with the Congress of Industrial Organizations to become the AFL-CIO, a very powerful and prominent labor union, especially in the second half and the 19th and the first half of the 20th, the entirety, really, of the 20th century, we finally have a labor organization that's going to figure out at least how to recruit and to stay alive, even if in the 19th century it's not going to be terribly successful in wresting concessions from management. What the AFL really does better than anything else is figure out how to organize itself, how to recruit and hold its members. So the AFL was open only to skilled workers. So unskilled workers, not welcome. And skilled workers tended to be less radical than unskilled workers because their conditions were better by and large. The other thing the AFL did that was innovative was to organize its union along craft lines. And so what it did is, under the American Federation of Labor, and a federation is a grouping together of sort of independent bodies, right? If you're a Star Trek fan, you have the United Federation of Planets, for example. So you have a printers union, you had an electricians union, you had a plumbers union, you had a carpenters union, you had a teamsters union. Teamsters are guys who drove horses and wagons, the equivalent of truck drivers in the 20th century. And so you grouped your workers together around their skill. Which allowed them to identify with each other, to better communicate, cooperate with each other. They had similar jobs, they had similar problems, they would seek similar solutions to those problems. And so as a means of organization, this was very, very smart. At least in the 19th century, the American Federation of Labor stayed away from politics. It wasn't going to pick Republican, it wasn't going to pick Democrat, it wasn't going to pick up social issues. It wasn't trying to create utopian reform. It didn't care about things like temperance or work-run industries. It just sort of looked at the world as it existed and said, what do we need, and what do we need right now? And what we need is pragmatic goals, pragmatic improvements. So the American Federation of Labor argued for higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. Higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. And here we find what today would be considered the traditional goals of labor unions. For our members, we want higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. And to get those things, we are not afraid to use our muscle. We will try to persuade management that it is in their interest to give us these things. If they give us these things, we'll give them an efficient and reliable, productive labor force. But if they don't give us these things, if they're not willing to play fairly with us and to treat us with dignity and respect, then we're willing to use strikes. We're willing to use boycotts. And that was a much more appealing approach than the Knights of Labor, initial stance of, oh, no, we don't want to have conflict with management in labor. And as a consequence, the American Federation of Labor grew steadily. It didn't have the big influxes of the Knights of Labor or the National Labor Union, but nice, steady progress. In 1886, it had 140,000 members. In 1892, it had 250,000 members. By 1901, it has over 1 million members. And at that point, 1/3 of all skilled workers in America belong to the AFL. By the time you get to 1914, there are 2 million members. One of the things about the Knights of Labor, though, was that it was sort of an elite labor union. So we already know unskilled workers are left out, and although technically minorities and women are allowed in reality they were by and large kept out, not by being prohibited entirely or explicitly, but by using high dues and technical exams to discourage women and blacks. So high dues, you have to pay dues to belong to a labor union. And of course, skilled workers make more money, and therefore they can afford to pay these dues. But remember, women make half of what a man does for doing the same work. Minorities don't do much better, and sometimes they do worse, and therefore they can't pay those high dues. So technically you're in if you can pay the fee, but if you can't pay the fee, and we know who can't pay the fee, then you're really out. The other way that you kept out minorities was through technical examinations. And there's a certain merit to this. If you're going to let a guy in your electrician's union, you want to make sure that he is a competent electrician. He's going to represent everybody who's a member of your union. But these technical exams were written. And many African Americans and some immigrants, of course, could not read or write, or they could not read or write English, or they couldn't do it well, and therefore they couldn't pass the exams. And once again, although technically they are allowed in, pragmatically, practically speaking, they are kept out. And that made the AFL something of an elite organization, and people like to belong to an elite organization. There's something that stokes the ego and inflates vanity if you can belong to something that most people cannot belong to. It's just a very human trait. And so the AFL managed to create that allure about itself. It managed to recruit and retain members. It managed to accumulate dues, and it is going to push hard for pragmatic reform. Not successfully in the 19th century, but it's going to keep itself alive so that it's around at the dawn of the 20th century, where it is going to enjoy a great deal more success. So how did management and labor respond to the union movement? Well, yeah, they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. Not only did it go against the grain of American society, it attacked the prerogatives and the power of management. The idea that, hey, look, I am giving you a job, and once you have that job, you accepted what that job was, you accepted what it was going to pay, you accepted the hours that you're going to work and the conditions under which you were going to work, and if you don't like it, you are free to quit and go someplace else. I can easily replace you, so I don't have to worry about that too much. So the idea of labor unions really was something that management and labor did not like, and by the way, it's something that a lot of Americans didn't like. A lot of ordinary Americans who were not caught up in this industrial labor class saw labor unions as dangerous and subversive, as un-American institutions. And therefore, they tended to look at the efforts of the robber barons, management and labor, to break up the unions positively. And management and ownership used all sorts of tactics to break up labor unions. They put spies in their ranks. They fired people who striked or agitated for labor goals, or tried to organize labor unions to get people to join. Sometimes they would employ thugs and brutes to intimidate and beat people up. They would whenever they could, inflame racial or ethnic tensions within the labor unions to sort of divide their organizations and keep them from coalescing. And most of these tactics, all of these tactics today, in fact, would be illegal. But at the time, these were not illegal. They were considered to be legitimate, and in some instances, people believed that they were right and that they were just. Breaking unions was part of management's playbook in the second half of the 19th century, and in fact, you will see plenty of it at the dawn of the 20th century as well. And so why were labor unions so unpopular, and why were they so ineffective? Well, it's not just the attitude of management that we're not going to give in, we're going to resist, we're going to undermine you, we're going to break you up. It was also because in face of that, labor was going to have to take what a lot of Americans considered to be really radical action, illegal action, un-American action, to try and get their demands. So strikes and boycotts. Well, today we have sort of a mental vision of what a strike would look like, right? So if somebody says, oh, American Airlines pilots and employees are on strike, and you go home and you turn on the TV, you know what you expect to see, right? And so, people carrying signs and walking in circles and chanting, what do we want? Better pay. When do we want it? Now. That, and men and women in very expensive clothes, getting together behind closed doors to try and hash things out, or giving statements to the press. That's what we think of a labor dispute looking like today. That's what we think of a strike looking like today. But of course, in the 19th century, that wasn't going to work. Management would fire people and hire replacements. And if that's all that it took to end a strike, why have a strike? As you go out on a strike, hey, we want an 8-hour workday. And management says, well, we're not going to give it to you, and everybody who is, arguing for it, you're fired now. Or if you say, we're not going to work until we get an 8-hour workday, management comes and says, well, if you're not going to work, you're fired. You're not doing your job. And if the workers say, oh, well, that's it, I guess they beat us, then what good is labor organization? And so strikes in the second half of the 19th century very often involved taking control of a factory or a mill or a railroad yard or something like that, physically shutting it down, keeping it from working, keeping it from operating, and of course that then keeps it from making a profit. And so you're hitting your employer, the owner of the industry, where it really matters, in the pocketbook. But where this tended to go wrong was that all of these industries, all of these factories, all of these mills, all of these railroads were private property. And private property is enshrined in the American psyche, and it's enshrined in American law, and it's enshrined in the Constitution. You can't mess with a person's private property. And so if the workers go on strike, demanding an 8-hour day, better wages, better working conditions, and they occupy the factory, in order to put economic pressure on the employer to negotiate, and the employer says, all right, you're all fired, you're no longer entitled to be in the factory, get off my property. And of course the workers can't just say, oh well, you outfoxed us again, we're done, you win. No, they're going to stay in the factory. Well, that means they're trespassing. That means they're messing with somebody's private property, and at that point they're breaking the law. They're breaking the law. And employers have lawyers, and the lawyers are going to go to the courts, and they're going to get an injunction. And remember what an injunction is. An injunction is a court order to stop doing something, permanently or temporarily, but it's a court order to stop doing something. And so you go and you get an injunction against the union that says, get out of this man's factory. And of course, if that's all it took, then why strike? And so the factory strikers would refuse to leave, and now they're in violation of a court order, which gets into criminality. And so the police are brought in, and they are used to drive the strikers out of the factory or the mill or something like that. And of course, the strikers very often resisted, and that meant that there was very often violence, and people on both sides would get hurt. Of course, the police, sometimes, in fact, very often used very heavy-handed tactics to deal with strikers. And remember that a lot of the strikers are unskilled factory workers, and many of them are immigrants. They're not native born, and so there's a prejudice against them by native born Americans, and all of this plays in to what's going on. And so strikes tend to become violent. Strikes tend to be controversial, and that violence makes for newspaper headlines, and those newspaper headlines are generally not kind to the striking workers. And remember that a lot of the newspapers are beholding to the robber barons in these great industries, and so they're hardly objective in how they're reporting all of this. Of course, there were pro-union papers as well, but they spoke to already pro-union audiences, where most of your major papers are speaking to people who are not industrial workers, who are not caught up in this, and what they're reading about is disruption. They're reading about violations of private property. They're reading about defiance of the law, and they're reading about people who are not native-born Americans, who are going against the grain of American society by trying to dictate to their employer the conditions of their employment. Between 1800 and 1900, there were some 23,000 strikes involving 6.6 million workers, and almost all of those strikes took place after the American Civil War in the second half of the 19th century. And some of them, as I said, became very violent. There was a severe strike in the railroad industry in 1877, and by the time that it was over, hundreds of workers had been killed. And of course, when you're reading about pictures of violence and this sort of thing, then that tends to turn people off. And unfortunately for the labor movement, not only was there violence often associated with their efforts and this impression amongst the general public that they were lawless and that they were dangerous, there was also the accretion around the labor movement of political activists who were advocating what most Americans considered to be very un-American ideas: anarchism, communism, socialism. And there were plenty of examples of this, but one of the most famous is the so-called Haymarket Riot, which takes place in May of 1886. And so you have a union that is going on strike against the McCormick Harvester Works, and as a consequence of this, you have an injunction. The workers are told that they have to get out of the factory. They refuse. The police move in. There is violence, and several workers are killed, are hurt, and one is killed. And this leads to May 4th protest meeting in Haymarket Square in Chicago, which is a major industrial hub. What the workers had been arguing for was an 8-hour workday. And the McCormick Harvester Company wasn't going to give it to them, and they had struck, and there had been violence, and the workers wanted to make the case that they were being treated unfairly. So it was a peaceful political rally, kind of boring as these things go, but after it had run for a while, the police showed up in mass, in formation, and moved in and said that this is an illegal assembly, and ordered the crowd to disperse. And at that point, someone in the crowd threw a dynamite bomb at the police. It killed one officer immediately and mortally wounded 6 others. The police responded by opening fire. 4 protesters at least were killed, and many others were hurt. The crowd, of course, dissipated very quickly, and this was quite the sensation. And it was called a riot, even though it really doesn't qualify as a riot in any sense of the term whatsoever. There was no looting, there was no violence beyond this bloodshed between the police and some of the protesters. And although there was never any proof as to who threw the bomb or who made the bomb, the Chicago police arrested 8 prominent anarchists, and the anarchists are people who want to get rid of government, who want to get law enforcement, and these were very well-known people. They had been advocating what was considered to be a very unpopular political creed, a very un-American political position, and they were tried, and 8 of them were convicted, and 4 of them were hanged. And now, some years later, some of those who weren't hanged were pardoned because this was really a travesty of justice. There was no evidence that showed that any of these men had advocated violence. There was no evidence that any of them had thrown the bomb, although one of them did have bomb-making equipment in his house. But what they had done is they had spent a long time rabble-rousing, and therefore it was considered that they had incited all of this, that they were the cause of it, and therefore this is how they were dealt with. And whether it was fair or not at the time, it was certainly perceived as a miscarriage of justice by history. In the moment, people were reading about this in the newspaper, and what are you connecting together? You're connecting anarchism, these unpopular American ideas, with labor unions, with labor unrest, a bomb thrown at police, and it's really easy to put all of this together in the popular mind, especially if the popular mind is already inclined in that direction. And so these were very common kind of events. This Haymarket riot is an example, but it's certainly not the least of them. So over and over and over again, these politically unpopular ideas, socialism, communism, anarchism, tend to get wrapped up in labor movements. And that's not because the labor movements themselves are espousing these things, but it's because people who were advocating communism, anarchism, socialism were advocating things that were unpopular and that were revolutionary. And where are they going to go to try and find converts to their cause? Well, it makes sense, isn't it, that they are going to go toward an organization whose members have already done something that's unpopular and is considered un-American by a lot of people. They've joined a union. So if I'm looking for kindred spirits or people I can convince to come over to my point of view, then I'm going to go hang out with the crowd that already is disaffected, that's already doing things that run counter to what the mainstream public wants to see. And so as a result, there was a lot of unwanted political motive that was attached to the labor movement. Now, some of it was really there, but a lot of it wasn't. It was guilt, if you will, by association, and that association was not always unwelcome. So labor unrest became an average thing, or a common thing in the second half of the 19th century. It would not do the labor movement any good. It was going to have to change tactics a little bit in how it dealt with things if it was going to begin to gain success. So that is the flip side to the coin. This is what's going on with the people who are working in the factories and the mills and whatnot, who are making all of that money for the likes of Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan. It's the beginning of a tumultuous relationship that is going to take many decades to sort itself out, and is going to take a change in attitude among the American people and among the American press before labor is going to really begin to succeed in its goals. And so that brings us to an end of the third lecture. We have looked at what we want to look at in chapter 19. So in the next lecture, we will go into chapter 20. We'll spend a little bit more time there talking about politics in the second half of the 19th century, and of course the rise of monopolies, the trust, the labor movement. All this is going to get caught up in politics as well as one might expect. So now for your questions from this chapter. And so the first question for this, so this would be question 11 as we're going forward in your collecting your questions and your answers as part of your test. So question number 11, what is the first labor union to stage a successful strike against a railroad? What's the first labor union to stage a successful strike against a railroad? Question number 12. William Silvis created the first well-known labor union in American history. What was the name of that labor union? William Silvis created the first well-known labor union in American history, and what was the name of that labor union? Question number 13, when a court issues an order for someone or some organization to stop doing something. When a court issues an order for someone or something to stop doing something, what is that called? What is the name of a court order that tells somebody or something to stop doing something? Question number 14, when women took control of a certain career field like nursing or teaching or being a librarian or something like that, when women took control of a certain career field and the men left it, what is that process called? When women took control of a certain career field and men left it, what is that process called? And finally, question number 15, and that question is, what is the name of the labor union that admitted only skilled workers, organized them along craft lines, and embraced purely pragmatic goals like better wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions? What is the name of the labor union that allowed only skilled workers into its ranks, organized them along craft lines, and embraced only pragmatic goals like better wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions? So those are your 5 questions from this lecture. That brings us to the end of chapter 19, lecture number 3. And when we get together by YouTube next time, we are going to turn our attention to politics at the second half of the 19th century. Remember that you can always email me if you have questions, you want to talk about the material, you have some other sort of concerns concern. So don't be shy. I will always be happy to hear from you and to help you out. And I look forward to seeing you next time.